Thanks, Grace. Appreciate that. Thanks for the introduction. And I want to say hello, bonjour, buongiorno, namaste. We've got people from all over the world out here on our Zoom chat, so that's really exciting for Jim and I. So we thanks for attending our session. There's been a lot of information in this um, presentations that have been given. So let us introduce ourselves here. My name is Michael Harshbarger. I'm a project manager at Deque Systems. Been here for a couple years. Before here, I actually worked for a Fortune 40 company for about 22 years, 13 years as a project manager. Did a lot with programs, but also agile as well. And we're excited to share some of my experience with you guys today. Jim, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Jim Lee. I am a consultant in Deque's Accessibility Program Office. And prior to coming to Deque, I spent 20 years in IT at a Fortune 40 company, and I have been in the business of digital accessibility for 7 years.
Cool. So one of the things Jim and I wanted to note is we're going to go through this presentation, and this is really a 30,000 foot look at accessibility and accessibility transformation. Jim and I freely admit we could spend hours on any of these topics. In fact, some of our cohorts have presented on these topics throughout the week. But as Grace said, if you guys want to dig into any of these topics further, definitely ask us questions at the end, or we can even start a discussion offline. So just wanted to set the expectations walking into this. The first thing I want to talk about is exactly why we named this presentation what we did. I think everybody can remember the lines, Houston Tranquility Base, here the Eagle has landed, because that was the immortal words of Neil Armstrong once that lunar lander touched that surface. What a lot of people forget is Charlie Duke's words, and Charlie is the picture in the middle of this slide sitting at the mission control desk of what he responded to Neil once Neil had transmitted that back to Earth. And that was his exact words were, Roger, tranquility, we copy on the ground, there's a bunch of guys about to turn blue, we're breathing again, thanks a lot. That's a weird response for that historic event. And it could have been the excitement that got Charlie a little tongue-tied, or it could be the fact that Charlie was aware that the Eagle had 14 seconds of fuel left when it actually touched the moon's surface. I mean, to give you an idea of the fragility of the craft that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had landed on the moon, had that craft dropped from the height of about 10 feet, so if you're in a house, if you look up at your ceiling from about that height, they would have actually snapped the landing gear off and not been able to take off again. Had they dropped from a height of 7 feet, knowing what we know about the surface of the moon now, they would have acted like a lawn dart and pretty much bent the landing gear on that craft and not been able to take off. So they were really close to making probably what considered one of the biggest successes into a failure, 14 seconds. In fact, one of the reasons Charlie knew it was 14 seconds away is because Gene Kranz, who was the mission coordinator, the mission lead, if you listen to the transcript, or you listen to the talking on mission control side, because you can get access to that now, within 30 seconds, Gene Kranz announced, quit all chatter. I only want to hear fuel call-outs from on now, because he knew how dangerously close they were. In fact, Neil Armstrong knew how dangerously close they were, because his heartbeat was around 150 beats per minute. And for a pilot that's in excellent shape, I think we could all admit 150 beats per minute lets us know that Neil was a little stressed when he put that craft down. Let's go back, though, from the moon landing to actually 1961. 1961, JFK gives a very important speech to Congress, charging the United States with landing a man on the moon and returning him to Earth before the end of the decade. And we know they were successful 8 years later of landing a man on the moon and getting him back to Earth safely. Now, we're thinking, okay, that's sending somebody 238,900 miles from the Earth to the moon in the vacuum of space. How does that go to a accessibility program? Well, you know what? It seems like a very tall task sometimes. It seems like a very big endeavor, depending on the size of the organization you're in, or even the kind of people you're working with. And so what Jim and I wanted to do is take some lessons learned from Apollo 11 and the Apollo program and the space program NASA did in the 1960s and apply it to another possible tall task for a lot of people on this phone call, on this meeting today. And that is getting your accessibility program set up. So where we're going to start is at the beginning, and that is providing a vision, right? So back to 1961, like I said, Kennedy announced that he said, I believe that the nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind nor more important to the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Now, the great thing about the words that Kennedy provided is he did provide the who, where, what, and why. But if you'll notice, in his statement, he did not provide the how. The reason he didn't provide the how is because he wanted the team to own that how, right? He could have easily said, hey, this is how we're going to do it, or this is how I want NASA to proceed with this. In fact, they had done a study prior to this speech about landing a man on the moon, because he asked NASA, hey, if we're behind the Soviet Union right now, if we want to catch the Union, where can we catch them? And the expert said landing a man on the moon, and they had an idea of the steps that we needed to take to make it. But he did not want to give the team the how. And because the team could own the how, he again committed self. A nation should commit itself. It was a we statement. It wasn't a he statement or an I statement. It was a we statement. He let the country own it. He let NASA own it. He let the people figuring out the how to own it. A famous story, you might have heard about this, is the janitor. In 1962, Kennedy went on a tour of Cape Canaveral. And at that time, he spotted a janitor in the hall, and he walked up to the janitor and he said, hey, what do you do here? And the response from the janitor looking at the President of the United States was, I'm landing a man on the moon. So he felt he owned that. In fact, my mother shared with me is she worked in a factory up in New Hampshire that built parts for the Mercury space capsule. So even the predecessor to Apollo. And she said very quickly that even building parts, just a small part for that aircraft, for that spacecraft, she felt like she owned that mission, that she was part of that spacecraft, that space mission. Jim?
So as we look at providing the vision as it relates to building a digital accessibility program, when I first put this slide together, I had executive sponsorship is important. But then I came back and I changed that to the word crucial. Now, I'm not saying that you can't grow a digital accessibility program through a grassroots effort or with minimal executive sponsorship, but I will say that it's very, very, very difficult. So it's a lot easier to share the vision across the entire organization when that vision comes from somebody high in your leadership chain. And if you want to build a program that's going to be, sustainable, it's going to stick around, it's going to be able to survive change, and it's going to be effective and efficient, then you're going to have to establish certain things. So whether that be, a policy, or that's removing the roadblocks to establish that policy or the governance around that policy, having that leadership to support you is going to make that a lot easier. It's going to really help you jumpstart your efforts. Because in the end, you really want digital accessibility to be fully integrated into your organization so that you're thinking about it the same way you think about other non-functionals, like security and performance. And again, the key here is that sustainability piece, right? So you're going to have organizational structure change, and you're going to have foundational elements put in place. So again, foundational elements that could be your internal policy, that could be standing up a centralized digital accessibility team, your this year's funding or your multi-years funding, all those things that are going to help make your program permanent and be able to survive change. Those are all the things that having that executive buy-in is going to make so much easier for you. So what do we want you to think about here? The next slide for me, Michael. Thank you. Who in your organization would be your JFK? Who is the person that has enough influence to advance your digital accessibility vision across the enterprise? Who can help you remove roadblocks? Who do you think you could talk to that you could help create that passion?
And Jim, I think it was important that you'll notice at the end of each section, we're doing these think about slides, because one of the things we wanted to make sure we did with this presentation was give you guys some actionable items out of each of these, the things that you could ponder or you could think about or you could execute to help you move forward with your program as well. So our next piece is understanding the costs, right? So long-term focus on budget, not short-term gains. And so Kennedy understood that, right? This decision demands a major national commitment of scientific, technical manpower, materials, facilities, and the possibility of diversion from other important activities where they already were thin spread. I mean, he actually says this in his speech to Congress and admits to him that, hey, this has got to be a long-term vision. This cannot be hey, we're just going to spend some money on a year or two and be successful on that. In fact, he even in his speech says, if we are to go only halfway or reduce our sites in the face of difficulty, in my judgment, it would not be better to go at all. So he even realized that this is going to be an arduous task that's going to take a lot of funding, manpower, effort, and in some cases at the expense of other important activities. In fact, it peaked in 1966 at $5.9 billion, or 5% of the national budget, which I think in today's term, if you looked at the budget and someone said, hey, we're going to spend 5% on space exploration, a lot of people would say, time out. Let's look at the other problems that are out on the field. Are we sure we want to spend that time? The other thing that have to be is logistics and execution had to work together, right? There was a lot of moving parts in their program. There's 81,000 engineers working on this program in 1966. So you had to define policy and standards. They had to be engaged in multiple work streams. So all 81,000 had to be divided up and be working on different pieces at the same time. You had to create roadmaps and make sure that they understood what they were working on and what the long-term goal is, right? I'm going to identify short and mid, then are going to move to long-term goals. I can't imagine being a coordinator on a project with 81,000 engineers working on it and trying to keep all those pieces straight. But it got done, and it got done well.
So as we look at the cost, for building your accessibility program, NASA basically had an open checkbook. Now, I've yet to meet a client that has that luxury. It would be nice, but that hasn't happened yet. So one of the things you're going to need to do in order to pay for this, to keep it simple, is you're going to need to have a solid business case, right? So as you go to build that business case, the first thing you're going to have to look at is motivators. So, what will motivate your leadership to fund your efforts? Is it risk? Is it the state of accessibility as it relates to litigation right now and the way it's currently trending? Is that what's going to speak to your leadership? Or do you also include things that are more positive, like the untapped market share that people with accessibility issues represents, improving your company's brand? Those are all things that can get buy-in from leadership. of course, we're talking about costs, so you're going to need to be as accurate as you can as you estimate out how this is going to impact your organization. So you're going to have considerations. If you're standing up a centralized team, how are you going to staff that? Are you providing training to who and how many? Are you purchasing software and tooling to assist you in your digital accessibility effort? And then remember too, there's multiple areas involved. It's not just an IT thing for sure. Legal, procurement. So when you're looking to procure third-party vendor, content, things of that nature. Compliance, governance, risk. Those are people you're going to have to work with as well. And then one of the things you're going to want to do to move your program forward a lot of times is establish a policy, right? And support that with governance. So it's going to be easier for you to estimate out your cost for that direct line of sight stuff. Like how many hours is it going to take me to create and communicate and publish a policy? What's going to be a little bit more difficult, and you shouldn't be surprised if your leadership asks this, is they're probably going to know, how is that policy going to impact all my different dev teams? What's that cost going to be? That's going to be a little bit harder to ascertain. And then know too, pretty typical, especially once you get this thing moving, that you're going to have multiple streams of income, right? So if you're looking at your budget, for the first year, the second year, or beyond, you're going to want to need to consider all the moving pieces, like NASA had. In order to keep track of all that, in order to report back to leadership, in order to do all these estimates, you're going to have roadmaps. And again, your roadmaps could be in multiple places, right? You could have roadmaps for your content migration, right? As you phase that in, you could have roadmaps for the maturing your physical program and things of that nature. And then you're going to have to consider your scope. So how much work are we going to do this first year? Well, what's your scope? Are you targeting WCAG 2.0 AA or 2.1? What digital assets will you focus on first? That first year, will you include more than web? Does that include mobile, multimedia, PDFs, internal applications? And then what timelines can you manage, right? That's all going to help you determine, what your costs are. And then finally, what are your goals? What are your goals both, in the short term and the long term? And based on your resources, what can you afford to do that, that first year? And, in my mind, it's a triangle, right? It's scope determines cost determines effort, and then effort's going to determine your timelines. But these are all key pieces here when you're thinking about what it's going to cost you. So what do we want you to think about? So what motivators will resonate with your leadership as you're building out your business case? Do you know all the areas that need to be involved? Have you gone through that thought process? And just remember, digital accessibility is a journey. You're not going to do this in one shot. So you need to be thinking about your costs, not just your first year, but over time. Which kind of leads me to my last bullet here. When people are building these sustainable efforts, especially in larger enterprises, I call it a front-loaded cost. And what I mean by that is, if you could graph it out, it's going to look like a wave. Because that first year, you're typically spending a lot of time and resources building those foundational elements, you're going to see the cost be higher that first year or two. But over time, as things become more embedded, as digital accessibility gets more ingrained in your organization, those costs are going to come down, because you're not going to be standing up some of those foundational items anymore. And that's why it kind of looks like a wave, and it should eventually flatten out after 3 or 4 years.
Good point, Jeff. All right, dates, milestones, metrics. Those are important. We've talked about milestones a couple times already. But you got to see progress in the journey, right? As you're moving, again, you've got to see progress. And because of that, you've got to have some kind of measurement that's going to validate your success, right? So again, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, NASA had steps it knew it had to take to meet the landing on the moon. It wasn't like, hey, tomorrow we're going to send a man to the moon, or we're going to send a spaceship to the moon. You had to have unmanned and suborbital and orbital missions. You had to have manned suborbital and orbital missions. You got to dock and undock 2 spacecrafts in space. There had to be two spacecrafts that were able to track each other in space. They had to send a spacecraft to the moon and back. In fact, Apollo 10, the astronauts descended within 8 nautical miles of the moon's surface. They got into the lunar lander and actually started going down to the lunar surface like they were going to land it. And at 8 nautical miles, they came back up. You had to be able to soft land a craft on the moon, right? You had to have different rocket types. You had to figure out food and water and air supply. But by doing these milestones, you're able to show your stakeholders, in this case, Congress in the United States of America, the people that are funding your project, that you're making progress and that you're having momentum. And then you measured tolerance on materials and the human body, physics and trajectory, fuel and life supports assets, because these metrics are going to allow you to make decisions and course correction through the effort of the life cycle of your project. And that's what the space mission did, is they made subtle changes as they went along to get better and better at the goals that they were trying to achieve.
So this is actually my favorite slide, and I really kind of wanted to do a talk, a presentation just on metrics, but Greg Williams at Deque kind of beat me to the punch on that, and I think he's already done that presentation here at CSUN. So what I want to do here in this slide is I just want to, I kind of want to lean on some key things here. So successful programs, they're measurable. They are measurable every time. They have dates and they have milestones, and absolutely those are key to achieving your goals. But what I want to kind of focus on a little bit more here is the actual metrics, right? So metrics give you two things. They give you the ability to see your program success and report to leadership. And they also help you identify deficiencies in your processes so you can make adjustments. And this is why I say that metrics are more than just monitoring. So that second bullet there where I talked about identifying deficiencies, that's where you have to start looking at metrics from the perspective of, results-driven metrics versus activity-driven metrics, right? So result-driven metrics would be like standing up some monitoring in production to look at your web applications and scanning those. So that's gonna tell you, which applications are doing well with digital accessibility and which ones are not. But it doesn't tell you the why. And see, that's where activity-driven metrics kind of come into play. And that's why the only examples of metrics I'm kind of giving up here on this slide are what I call activity-driven metrics. So for example, accessibility considerations exist in your business requirements. So are you measuring that? Are you making sure that digital accessibility is being injected as far left or as early in the development cycle as you can? Along those same lines, are you measuring that accessibility peer-to-peer design reviews are taking place? Are those happening? Are you keeping track of those? Which teams aren't? Which teams are? Are the number of dev teams that are utilizing accessibility software in their daily builds? So if you've procured software that they can utilize, are they using it, to make themselves more efficient? The number of developers who've taken accessibility training, and really for that matter, the number of people, period, whatever role they're in, if you're providing this training, are they taking it? And then, the consumption of online training materials, so like at Deque, we have Deque University. If you've purchased license for this, are, the people in your enterprise, are they utilizing it? Are you keeping track of that? And then the last example I have here, because really this could probably be 2 or 3 pages of examples, but the last one I have is, are QA teams utilizing digital accessibility tools? And really for that matter, are they utilizing a consistent testing methodology? Mm-hmm. Those are the kind of things that you can measure to tell you the why you are being successful or not being successful. And then of course, once you know that, you can make adjustments. So what we want you to think about here is what can you measure in your organization that will show not only that your content is more accessible, but that you're doing it in the most efficient manner. And these metrics, especially these activity-driven metrics, they're gonna, help you articulate the success, and really for that matter, any lack of success you're having, implementing digital accessibility. But the important thing is then you'll know where to make the changes, where to make the adjustments.
So we'll move to not only, now we've talked about cost, we've talked about making sure that you have the right executive sponsor, the fact that you have got dates, milestones, you've got measures in place, but now it's the important things is about taking the right risks, right? We talked about NASA's early milestones were mainly unmanned missions because human lives were at stake, right? So what you needed to do is align those risks to priorities, right? That risk to execution. So in some cases, NASA, what they did is they focused on the smaller pieces. They delivered success early in the life cycle to be able to get momentum moving, right? The first flight was actually suborbital, and it was made by Alan Shepard. Was that a huge success? It was a success in the terms that we got a man up and down in a rocket ship, right? That was a smaller piece of the biggest puzzle, because you can't even get off the ground, you can't make it to the moon. And so NASA said, what are the right risks to take, and when should we take those risks?
So there's some version of a quote out there that exists that says, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And I've always really liked that quote, especially when the plan is big and complex. There's almost always going to be parts of that plan that don't work out the way that you thought it would, and you're going to have to make adjustments. And so what I'm really saying here is if you're new to digital accessibility, then don't bite off more than you can chew. Maybe start out with a pilot project, right? And while that pilot project is running, start considering, okay, if we're going to make all of our content accessible, or certain content accessible, what's gonna go first, and risk plays a big part in that determination. So are you going to look at your digital assets with the most traffic? Are you going to look at what you would consider business critical, websites and applications? And when I say business critical, what I mean by that is, the question you would ask yourself is, if any user, regardless of ability, were unable to use that particular digital asset, would it have repercussions in your enterprise? And if you could answer yes to that, then you should consider that business critical. As you look at the legal landscape, have you seen key business functionality that you provide? Has that been targeted by litigation in your industry? And then another one that gets overlooked sometimes is, do you have any digital assets that you're currently exposing through a marketing or an advertising campaign? So what do we want you to think about in here? So what's your organization's risk tolerance? So as you're looking to get this thing started, what do you, how much can you handle? And then what will you tackle your first year? What is most important to your organization? And then make sure that you can tell the story of why you're parsing out the work in that particular way, because then that's going to show them what you looked at and how you came to those conclusions.
The other important thing that we looked at was getting the right people in the right seats. I mean, if you look at our presentation, right, 14 seconds for failure, it's because how much fuel was left before Neil Armstrong would have to abort the landing. There was a reason Neil was in that seat. Michael Collins, the pilot of the command module, tells a story of Neil when Michael and him shared a story of when they were kids. They had bought one of these airplanes with the rubber band that you stick the airplane in the rubber band, you pull the rubber band back and you let go and the airplane flies. And Michael Collins said he wanted his plane to fly farther. So what did he do? He went out and he bought a bigger rubber band to get his airplane to fly farther. Well, what did Neil do? Neil went into his parents' garage and he built a wind tunnel so he could figure out how to make the airplane more aerodynamic. It was that kind of person that was going to have that attention to detail when taking over control of the aircraft that you want in the driver's seat on such an important thing. Now, some people will also say the right people in the right seats. The reason why the mission was successful is because they had a Purdue grad at the helm driving it into the final stages. I know Jim will agree with that 100% on that one. But also, not only did they have somebody in the right seat to land that lunar module, the other picture that you see on this slide that a lot of people don't know the name, it's Jim Webb. Jim Webb was the administrator of NASA from 1961 to about 1968. What did Jim do? Well, Jim held the passion for the program. Jim actually would go to Congress and talk to Congress about how important the moon landing was to the nation. Once Kennedy passed away and was assassinated in 1963, Jim Webb is the one who took that mantle of landing someone on the moon by the end of the decade and kept it forefront in people's minds. This is also a tie back to the fact of how important that executive sponsorship is, because that executive sponsor, JFK, picked Jim Webb to lead NASA during this time because he knew Jim was passionate about what NASA was trying to achieve and how they were going to achieve it, and could show that passion to others.
Okay, so forgive the analogy, but it's not rocket science. Okay, so as you look to say build out your program's team, look for people in your organization that are passionate about digital accessibility, and then recruit them. And if you're struggling to find passion, then honestly, I would take legitimately interested, because that can then grow into passion, right? I always say I will take a good employee over a good process any day, because good people, good employees, they can adapt. They have agility and they can react to things, whereas processes, they just can't do that. And as you look to stand up this program over time, you're going to have ups and downs. And so having people with passion, it's going to make, it's going to carry them through those downtimes, right? And then also too, as you look about getting the right people in the right seats, successful programs, digital accessibility teams, they're not made entirely of accessibility experts, okay? There's going to be other skill sets. And remember, if you think back to, we talked about all the moving parts and the different areas that you're going to be interacting with, well, you're going to need people that can do that interaction. So if you look at risk and compliance, does that mean you go out and you find somebody from risk and compliance and recruit them? Probably not, but maybe what you do is you get somebody on the team who spent a lot of time working directly with risk and compliance. Find people that you can staff your team with that are versed in enterprise-wide communications, people that are familiar with process integration. And then as you look for, say, your frontline leadership, project manager or your program manager, find somebody who has experience in organizational change and program management, who's familiar with change management, generally speaking, because that's what we're talking about. If you're going to get digital accessibility from, something that some people may not understand or have heard of, to that same place as say security or performance, it's going to take change management. So you should have a leader who has experience in that space.
And Jim, I think you and I would agree. This point Jim and I are very passionate about, and the reason why we're passionate about is both of us are examples of exactly what Jim just talked about, right? We weren't accessibility experts coming to the table. What we were experts in another discipline, and somebody saw we had passion about accessibility and making sure that accessibility was part of an organization. And they said, hey, can you come over and help us with this? And both of us said, wow, that's a great opportunity. And so I think Jim and I can say, this is one of these that we can definitely say, been there, done that, have the t-shirt, and can talk about that one in depth, right, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up, Michael. And also too, the last bullet here talks about the metrics. And, it's probably going to be a good idea to pull people in who have experience with enterprise level metrics. And then finally here is the where. So where do you look? Well, obviously within your organizations is an ideal place to look, at least to start. But it's quite possible, especially if you're new to digital accessibility, that you may not have digital accessibility experts in your organization. So you're going to have to look outside your organization. So, whether that be through hiring directly or until you can get someone hired or get folks in your space trained up, you may have to look at like a third-party vendor like a Deque to supply you with that expertise. So what do we want you to think about here? Who in your organization is passionate about accessibility, and can you get them? Do you have the ability to get them onto your team so they can help move digital accessibility forward in your program? And who in your organization has those ideal skill sets? So as you think of all the moving parts and all the different people you're going to be interacting with, how do you staff your team so that it has all the right skill sets? And then if you're short on some of those and you have to look outside of your organization, do you know where to look? Do you know who all the players are in the digital accessibility industry? Does your HR department know how to craft that job description? Things like that, so that you have the ability to look outside your organization.
Yep. So the key is we've done all these things, and one of the things that we need to make sure every organization does is recognize their success. Mission complete. I mean, NASA, when they landed the man on the moon, knew that they had hit the goal. And the eruption in mission control when Neil stepped on the moon surface was fantastic. But I will tell you what really surprised me was the even more elation when that craft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, because they knew they had hit the mission 100%. Processes, procedures, technologies from the moon missions have lived on NASA and helped them achieve other successes. But the result was just not putting a man on the moon. As you can see here, there are other unintended benefits along the way that's helped and moved out into the other pieces of the world, right? In fact, I read an article the other day that said we would not have had the computer revolution we did unless the 1960s and the push to the moon would have happened. So it's just completely and utterly fantastic when you think how much impact this one effort had on the whole entire world.
So for me, the ultimate success, say your first year, beyond, say, creating, accessible digital content, it'll be the establishment of those foundational elements, right? Because that's where you get your sustainability. And again, when I'm talking about foundational elements, have you stood up a centralized team? And is it showing up in an org chart, right? And what I mean by that is if it's all virtual, if there's a change in leadership, there's a reorg, it's going to lose momentum. That team may not even survive. So if you can get that done in your first year, that's success. Is based on your measurements, is digital accessibility, is it getting embedded? Are people utilizing your software? Are people injecting digital accessibility considerations, at every level of test, from design to development to your QA? Do you have a policy? Have you written it, communicated it, published it? Do you have governance that can support it? Have you published your procedures and whatnot and shared that, in your first year? And then are you currently empowering your content creation teams? So what I mean by that is have you provided them with training? Have you supplied them with, adequate software to do this thing called digital accessibility? And then have you provided them with access to digital accessibility experts? So if they're struggling, they have someone they can lean on. And kind of like what Michael was pointing out, there's broader efforts here, like we saw in that last slide. So in our case, it would be, for example, risk mitigation. And not just in the sense that your content is becoming more accessible, but also too, if you're measuring correctly, you're going to be able to show the steps you've taken to make your content more accessible. And a lot of times in litigation, that's just as important. Another benefit is you're going to have exposed, a market share, representing $490 million. And then, your company brand and your image, it's going to be improved. And this one gets missed a lot. And I always like to mention this, better user experience. And again, this gets overlooked. And, once your content starts to become, more accessible, typically that results in a better experience for all your users, not just those with accessibility needs.
So Jim and I talked about, we've been talking about 40 minutes. And one of the things that we wanted to do is boil down this presentation. And hey, if you only took a few things away with you, I mean, we hope we take you more than a few, but if you take a few things away with you, what would we really, really, really want people to be able to say, hey, this is an important point that I think I need to do in my organization? The first one that Jim and I talked about was digital accessibility is bigger than what you think. It's just not a developer thing. So many times we hear that accessibility is an IT thing, right? Hey, IT needs to do this. Hey, IT needs to do this. As we mentioned, as Jim mentioned in the presentation, as we both believe, right, there's other places and departments that need to be involved. A lot of the successful efforts we've seen has gotten the business involved and gotten the business excited about accessibility because of some of the points that Jim just mentioned about increased market share, increased customer usability. Also, marketing can be part of that drive, and legal and compliance can be part of that drive. But to remember, it's just not, hey, IT needs to take care of this accessibility thing, and that's the only people that it benefits.
Yeah, and executive sponsorship, and there's my word again, crucial. It's so important. And again, it's not to say that you can't have successes without it, but I've harped on the foundational elements. Some of those are going to be impossible without leadership support, and they're so important, right? So I just can't emphasize enough just what a huge boost having executive sponsorship is for building your program.
We keep mentioning the word program. I know that kind of turns some people off because it's a very waterfallish type of word. Hey, there's a program here or this kind of situation. I think what Jim and I want to make sure everybody's on the same page of is there's got to be some kind of structure for the discipline. So even if it's a discipline lead or if it's a discipline train or whatever it would be, the fact is you've got to have a group that focuses on the discipline itself as well. And whatever you decide to call that, if you call that a program, if you call that a grand poobah, Jim and I are not going to lose sleep over that. But that structure of discipline is necessary.
And then, your long-term goal should be sustainability and effectiveness. So I'll do a really quick analogy on that. In the short term, you may assess an application, you may find 100 defects, and you may fix 95 of those. And that's success. I mean, that's a good story. But 3 or 4 years from now, if you're looking at that a different web page may be produced by those same developers, what you want to find is you just want to find 5 defects and you want them to fix all of them, because your long-term goal is that you want to ingrain this into your organization so that you're just not making those accessibility, you're not pushing those accessibility issues into production.
One of the questions I've seen we've already got that we'll definitely talk about is the fact is, okay, it sounds very waterfallish, but the truth of the matter is this particular aspect is very scope, plan, build, measure, adjust, rinse and repeat. If you look at business, it's no different than William Deming when he talked about plan, do, act. Plan, do, act. We call them iterations, right? We call it's an iterative piece, right? We're pulling things from the backlog. We're taking that backlog and we're tweaking it. Then we're building it. We're measuring how we're going to do, and it's a continual integration piece going back and forth, right? That's the key with this program. That's the key with this effort. That's the key with this discipline is you're going to learn as you go along, and you need to keep scoping, planning, building, measuring, adjusting, rinsing, and repeating as you go through the life cycle, because it's a very iterative process. It's a very iterative process. The key is, though, we've seen organizations do this. It is possible. One of the things that Jim, I think, mentioned again with his executive sponsorship, these items of accessibility just doesn't minimize your legal risk. A lot of people bring that up first, right? We need to minimize our legal risk and not get sued. But there's great examples in the industry of driving innovation, enhancing your brand, extending your market reach. So those three things are just as important as minimizing your legal risk, right? You can drive innovation with accessibility. You can enhance your brand with accessibility. You can extend your market reach with accessibility, and you can be successful. Jim?
Yeah, and the last thing I'll just say is this is truly a 30,000 foot view, and what we did is we looked at our experiences, you know, in a large enterprise and working in accessibility, and you know, our more recent experience, you know, working with clients that are trying to do the same thing. The reason we picked these pieces and put these together here in this presentation is because we looked at organizations that were doing those things, and that was the result was is they had a successful digital accessibility program. So at the end, what we're saying is this is possible. We've seen it in the real world.
And I know when we start using words like program and big words like that, don't think of it as only a big company thing. This could be one person, right? This could be one person doing these things, and that's the other thing that we wanted to make sure. I know a lot of the language when we talk about reaching the moon, we're talking about very large efforts. This can be a small effort based on the size of the work that you have and the size of the company you have too. All right, Grace, do we have questions sitting out there that we can talk through, please?
We do. Let's get into them. What roles have you found to be the best for executive vision and leadership? This person says, I'm working grassroots, but need executive buy-in to move forward.
Jim, you want to start taking that one?
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. So it says what roles? Can you repeat that again, Grace?
Sure, yeah. What roles have you found to be the best for executive vision and leadership? I'm working grassroots, but need executive buy-in to move forward.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's going to depend on your organization and how your leadership change structured. You know, I'm going to say at a minimum, it's going to have to be at least one level above frontline leadership, somebody who at least can get the ear of people higher up. Obviously, your ideal scenario is going to be, you know, like a COO, you know, someone who can speak to not only one department, but multiple departments. And honestly, we've seen it vary anywhere in there from, you know, second line leadership and higher up. But the equation is the higher up you go, the easier it's going to be. Of course, that's easier said than done to get that person's ear and to make that happen.
Well, and Jim, I think it also gets back to, we talked about the team and passion being important. Passion is just as important as your executive leadership. So it might not be the typical person that you find. I've seen executive leadership come from marketing, from UX, from business, but that passion is still important of understanding why and them not feeling it's a box that they need to check, but something that they need to be excited about.
Great. When defining and assembling my organization's accessibility team, how much effort should I plan to put into training and development? And what kind of expectations do I need to set with my management about this resource requirement?
Well, you can do two things on this one, and this is a great question. So I find that there's two ways to train, and that is, first, there is a very important thing, a very important piece to give a handful of individuals, and depending on the size of your organization, it can be for anyone from 1 to 20, a full baseline, a full foundation, right? So I would say you're going to take 20 or so individuals and stick them through a 2-3 day intense course to talk about how accessibility is and to see the overall picture. Then as you go out to the teams, there can be more just-in-time training, right? There can be more looking at the current asset they're working on and talking about the specific accessibility issues that they have within that digital asset. So it's not one of those things where I've seen organizations say, oh, we got to put everybody through training before we get this started. But there can be a tact where you say, I've got a subset of people who understand the full picture, and then they go out and start teaching people on the job, so that teaching is less whiteboard and more of, oh, that's how you fix this type. I've done that now. I can remember how to do that. Jim, you got thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, and I would just add also too that just, remember the phrase, if you don't use it, you lose it. So a lot of times if folks don't have the opportunity to apply what they learned, in a boot camp, they can lose that. So, two things there. You want to make sure that you have, say, refresher courses available online, things of that nature, but also too that your training is not just a one and done thing. You need to be prepared for turnover, because people do come and go. What happens when somebody new joins the team? So it needs to be treated with the same importance. And again, I know I use these examples all the time, but there's not one security class that a developer takes and never has to take it again. So accessibility you need to have a plan long-term for your training.
Well, and I will also say in some of the questions, and we don't get to some of them, one of the things I always encourage people is to look at those other IT ITIs: security, scalability, operability. Accessibility has a tendency to be looked at sometimes as those non-functional kind of ITIs that we all work with. So don't hesitate going to your peers who's had to talk about a scalability, or talk about security, or talk about operability or manageability of assets, and ask them what they see in training, what they see in executive sponsorship, because they've had to do very similar things to build that in the organization.
Great. Thank you. When estimating the effort, do you guys feel it's a good idea, once you've determined whether you're targeting WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 and which level, that you identify what success criterion to apply to your website?
So I think I'll take a stab at that. So I'm going to say you can. Obviously, if you're just beginning, there's ways that you can scope out your work. There's I've been at places where we target certain types of success criteria first. So the stuff that's going to have a serious or a high impact on the end user. You can also look at defects where one fixes it site-wide, things of that nature. So yeah, absolutely, as you're scoping out your work, especially for folks that are new to this, it can be overwhelming if you hand them 100 defects and go, these all need fixed, and they need fixed by next Tuesday. So
And Jim, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Look at impact. Look at the impact to the impact and probability we talked about kind of in different ways of, let's look at the pages that are getting hit the most. And let's start with those kind of issues. And then again, you start narrowing focus. And as you hit more pages, those criteria are going to expand more and more and more, because you're going to find different things. You might not have video on the first page, but you might have video on the next page. And so that's going to add a different success criteria. And so as Jim pointed out, that is a great way to handle it, is to just keep expanding your scope, keep expanding those success criteria as you keep moving along.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And Michael, I think you sort of touched on this earlier, but what are your thoughts on getting buy-in from small businesses where executive buy-in is typically smaller and financial resources are limited?
And this is one of those questions that get asked, of course, is accessibility is not just a big business thing. When you go to a small business, they do have limited resources. They do have limited resources in both time, money, and people, right? And so what you need to look at is not only looking at the let's not get sued piece, but also looking at your marketplace and who you can affect in your marketplace to increase the business, right? And so when I'm looking at a small business or a medium-sized business and I'm talking to them about accessibility, part of what I talk about is let's look at your product. Let's look at what you sell and how that can be marketed to a marketplace that you might not be marketing to right now, right? And that will allow a smaller, medium-sized business to decide what they need to invest in to make this happen, right? Because they do have limited resources.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we are at the top of the hour now. Thank you so much, Jim and Michael, for your presentation. Thank you so much to our attendees and your great questions. If we didn't get to them, we will follow up via email. So please look out for that, and have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time and your attention. Thanks.
Thanks, folks. Have a great day.